The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of room 304 in Thompson Hall, where Professor Sarah Mitchell stood before her advanced writing class. The prestigious Franklin University's English department was housed in this historic building, its worn wooden floors and green chalkboards telling stories of countless students who had passed through these halls. Professor Mitchell, a woman in her mid-40s with graying brown hair always neatly tied back, adjusted her reading glasses as she faced her students. She had been teaching for 15 years and had developed a reputation for being both strict and fair. Her current class of 30 students sat before her, some still looking sleepy despite it being 10 a.m., while others typed rapidly on their laptops, taking notes of her every word. "Today," she announced, her voice carrying to the back of the room, "we're starting our final project for the semester." A collective groan rose from several students, making her smile slightly. "Don't worry, I think you'll find this one interesting." In the back row, Marcus Thompson sat quietly, his dark eyes focused intently on Professor Mitchell. Unlike many of his classmates who were dressed in typical college attire of hoodies and jeans, Marcus always came to class in a crisp button-down shirt and khakis. At 22, he was a few years older than most of his classmates, though few knew the reason why. Professor Mitchell walked around her desk and picked up a stack of papers. "This assignment will test everything you've learned about narrative writing, research, and personal voice." She began distributing the assignment sheets. "You'll be writing about personal transformation, a moment that changed your perspective or understanding of the world." When the assignment sheet reached Marcus, he studied it carefully. His expression remained neutral, but his mind was already racing with possibilities. He had stories to tell, so many stories that could fit this assignment perfectly. But he also knew that some stories came with risks. "I expect nothing less than your best work," Professor Mitchell continued, returning to the front of the room. "This isn't just about good grammar or proper citation. I want to see your authentic voice shine through. After teaching for so long, I've developed a keen sense for each student's unique writing style." She paused, looking around the room with pride. "That's why this assignment counts for 40% of your final grade. It's not just about writing skills. It's about growth, authenticity, and pushing your boundaries as writers." The class buzzed with nervous energy. Some students were already whispering to each other, sharing ideas or concerns. But Marcus remained silent, making careful notes in his leather-bound notebook, a gift from his previous job, though none of his classmates knew that either. "Remember," Professor Mitchell added, "I'm available during office hours if you need guidance. This is a challenging assignment, but I believe each of you has a powerful story to tell." As she discussed the technical requirements, minimum length, formatting guidelines, and submission deadlines, Marcus's mind wandered to his own story. He thought about the years he spent working as a journalist, the late nights investigating leads, the countless interviews, and finally, the story that changed everything, the story that won him journalism's highest honor. When class ended, students packed up quickly, many already discussing their potential topics. Marcus took his time, carefully placing his notebook in his worn leather messenger bag. As he stood to leave, Professor Mitchell called out to the class one last time. "One more thing," she said, making everyone pause. "Don't be afraid to surprise me. The best essays I've read over the years have come from students who dared to be honest, who shared stories they thought might be too complex or controversial." Marcus felt her eyes sweep over the class, passing over him just like they did everyone else. He was used to it, being seen, but not really noticed. As he walked out of the classroom, he made his decision. He would write about his investigation into urban educational inequality, about the months spent documenting how systemic barriers held back bright students in underfunded schools. He would write about winning the Pulitzer Prize. But as he stepped into the bright sunlight outside Thompson Hall, Marcus couldn't help wondering how Professor Mitchell would react to his story. Would she see past her preconceptions? Would she believe that one of her students, particularly a quiet black student who barely spoke in class, could have achieved such recognition? Only time would tell. For now, Marcus headed to the library, ready to begin writing his story, a story that would challenge not just Professor Mitchell's assumptions, but the entire university's understanding of who their students really were. 2 weeks had passed since the assignment was given, and Professor Mitchell sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of student essays. The autumn evening was growing dark outside her window, and her desk lamp cast a warm glow over the papers. She had saved Marcus Thompson's essay for last, mostly because he had been so quiet in class that she had formed no real expectations about his writing. Taking a sip from her cooling coffee, she began to read. The first paragraph made her sit up straighter in her chair. By the second page, she had completely forgotten about her coffee. The essay began with a powerful scene, a young black teenager being told by his guidance counselor that he shouldn't bother applying to top colleges, despite having the highest grades in his class. From there, it expanded into a broader investigation of systematic discrimination in urban education. The writing was masterful, weaving personal experiences with detailed statistical analysis and compelling interviews. "This can't be right," Professor Mitchell muttered to herself, flipping back to the first page. The level of writing wasn't just good, it was professional. The essay discussed complex educational policies with the confidence of an experienced journalist. It cited interviews with education officials, referenced court cases, and included detailed statistical analysis of school funding disparities. She pulled up her laptop and began checking some of the sources cited in the essay. To her surprise, every reference was real, every statistic accurate. The writing style was sophisticated yet clear, something that took most journalists years to master. It seemed impossible that a regular undergraduate student could produce such work. Professor Mitchell picked up Marcus's attendance sheet. He had never spoken up in class discussions. During group work, he usually let others take the lead. How could this seemingly average student produce such exceptional writing? She remembered her words to the class about recognizing each student's unique voice. This essay's voice was nothing like the brief responses Marcus had written for other assignments. Those had been good but basic, nothing like this polished, professional piece before her. Standing up, she walked to her filing cabinet and pulled out Marcus's previous assignments. The contrast was striking. While his earlier works showed promise, they were typical undergraduate-level writing. This new essay read like it had been written by a seasoned professional journalist. Her mind went to the cases of plagiarism she had caught over the years. Students buying essays online, copying from obscure sources, or paying others to write for them. But this was different. The essay was too specific, too personal to be bought online. Yet it seemed too professional to be written by a student who barely participated in class discussions. Looking at the time, she saw it was nearly 9 p.m. The building was quiet now, most faculty and students long gone. She should go home too, but something about this essay wouldn't let her rest. Opening her browser, she began searching for articles about educational inequality, wondering if she might find the real source of this writing. After an hour of searching, she found nothing identical. The essay appeared to be original. Yet her suspicion grew stronger. In 15 years of teaching, she had never seen such a dramatic difference between a student's regular work and their final project. Professor Mitchell printed out the essay and placed it in her briefcase. Tomorrow, she would schedule a meeting with Marcus during office hours. She needed to look him in the eye and ask him about this essay. If he had really written it, he should be able to discuss his research process, explain his sources, and defend his analysis. As she packed up her things, she noticed a photo on her office wall, one taken at last year's faculty diversity training. She had smiled proudly for that photo, considering herself an advocate for student diversity. Now, in the quiet of her office, a small voice in her head wondered if her suspicion about Marcus's essay had anything to do with her own hidden biases. She pushed the thought away. This wasn't about race, she told herself. This was about academic integrity. Any professor would question such a dramatic improvement in a student's writing. It was her duty to investigate. Turning off her office light, Professor Mitchell stepped into the empty hallway. Tomorrow, she would get to the truth about Marcus Thompson's essay. She had no idea that the truth would force her to confront not just her assumptions about Marcus, but her entire understanding of who her students really were. The next afternoon, Marcus sat in the wooden chair across from Professor Mitchell's desk. The office was small but neat, with walls lined with books and academic certificates. Through the window behind her desk, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the room. The printed copy of his essay lay between them on her desk like a barrier. Professor Mitchell cleared her throat. "Mr. Thompson, do you know why I asked you to meet with me today?" Her voice was controlled, professional, but had an edge to it that made her sound more like a prosecutor than a teacher. Marcus sat straight in his chair, his expression calm. "I assume it's about my essay, Professor Mitchell." His voice was steady, showing none of the nervousness most students displayed when called to her office. Yes, it is. She picked up the essay, flipping through its pages. I've been teaching for 15 years, Mr. Thompson. I've read thousands of student essays. But I'd never seen anything quite like this. She paused, watching his face for any sign of guilt or discomfort. The writing is unusually sophisticated. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding where this was going. He faced similar situations before, though he had hoped it would be different in a university setting. The analysis of educational inequality, the statistical data, the interviews with officials. Professor Mitchell laid the essay back on her desk. This is professional-level journalism, Mr. Thompson. Not the work of an undergraduate student who barely speaks in class. The room fell silent. Outside, students walked past the window, their laughter muffled by the glass. Marcus took a deep breath, remembering similar moments from his past, times when people had doubted his abilities simply because of who he was. Are you accusing me of something specific, Professor Mitchell? His question was direct but polite, challenging her to state her suspicions clearly. She leaned forward in her chair. I need to know where this essay really came from. Did you find it online? Did someone help you write it? Because this writing style is completely different from your other assignments. Marcus felt a familiar weight in his chest, the weight of being underestimated, of having to prove himself yet again. But years of journalism had taught him to stay calm in tense situations. Professor Mitchell, he began, his voice remaining steady, you told us to write about personal transformation. I wrote about my experience as a journalist investigating educational inequality in urban schools. Every word in that essay is mine. She shook her head slightly. Mr. Thompson, I understand the pressure students are under, but claiming this level of professional work as your own, it's simply not believable. The sources, the interviews, the writing style. What exactly isn't believable? Marcus asked quietly. That I could write at this level, or that someone like me could write at this level? The question hung in the air between them. Professor Mitchell's face flushed slightly. This has nothing to do with. I'm simply concerned about the dramatic difference between this work and your previous assignments. Marcus reached for his messenger bag, the leather worn from years of use. Professor Mitchell, I think it's time I showed you something. His hands were steady as he took out his phone. Mr. Thompson, I don't see how your phone. Please, he interrupted gently. Just give me a moment. The tension in the room grew thicker as Marcus pulled up his professional portfolio. He could have shown it earlier, could have introduced himself as a Pulitzer Prize winner on the first day of class, but experience had taught him that sometimes people needed to face their own assumptions before they could learn from them. Professor Mitchell watched him with a mixture of impatience and confusion. She had dealt with plagiarism cases before, had heard every excuse imaginable. But something about Marcus's calm confidence made her uneasy. It didn't match her image of a student caught cheating. What she didn't know was that in the next few minutes, everything she thought she knew about Marcus Thompson would change. The quiet student in the back row was about to show her just how wrong her assumptions had been, and the revelation would shake not just her professional judgment, but her entire worldview. Marcus held his phone screen toward Professor Mitchell. On it was a professionally designed website with his photo at the top. Below the photo was a headline that made her eyes widen. Marcus Thompson wins Pulitzer Prize for Educational Inequality Investigation. Professor Mitchell's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her reading glasses. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Would you like me to explain? Marcus asked quietly. When she nodded, still staring at the phone screen, he continued. 3 years ago, I was working as a journalist for the City Tribune. I spent 18 months investigating how urban schools were being systematically denied resources and opportunities. He swiped to another page on his phone, showing photographs of him interviewing students, teachers, and administrators. I visited 47 schools across 5 cities. I interviewed over 200 people. I uncovered patterns of discrimination that were affecting thousands of students. Professor Mitchell's face had lost its accusatory expression, replaced by a mix of shock and embarrassment. She kept looking between Marcus and the phone, as if trying to connect the quiet student she thought she knew with the accomplished journalist on the screen. The story ran as a 12-part series. Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. It led to 3 superintendents resigning, 2 state investigations, and a major reform of school funding policies. He paused, letting the information sink in. That's why I wrote about it for your assignment on personal transformation, because it transformed not just me, but entire school systems. He swiped to another page, showing a video clip. In it, Marcus stood on a stage in a suit, accepting the Pulitzer Prize. The audience applauded as he gave a speech about educational justice and the power of investigative journalism. Professor Mitchell sank back in her chair, her earlier confidence completely deflated. Why? She struggled to find the right words. Why didn't you tell me this before? Marcus smiled slightly, but his eyes were serious. Professor Mitchell, I've learned that sometimes people need to confront their own assumptions. If I had told you on the first day of class that I was a Pulitzer Prize winner, would you have treated me the same as other students? She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. They both knew the answer. I came back to college to finish my degree because I believe in education, Marcus explained. The same investigation that won me the Pulitzer showed me how many talented students never get the chances they deserve. I wanted to experience the classroom again, but this time from a different perspective. Professor Mitchell stood up and walked to her window, needing a moment to process everything. Outside, students crossed the campus quad, unaware of the dramatic scene unfolding in her office. She thought about her earlier certainty, her quick judgment of Marcus's capabilities. I have to ask, she said finally, turning back to face him. Why this class? Why advanced writing when you're clearly already an accomplished writer? Marcus closed his portfolio app and put his phone away, because good writers never stop learning, and because I believe this class would challenge me to look at writing from new angles. He paused. Though I admit, I didn't expect to be accused of plagiarizing my own work. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. Here was Professor Mitchell, who prided herself on recognizing student potential, completely failing to see the remarkable talent sitting quietly in her classroom for weeks. Your essay, she said, looking down at the papers on her desk. It wasn't just about educational inequality, was it? It was also about assumptions, about how we judge people without knowing their full story. Marcus nodded. The best stories often work on multiple levels, Professor Mitchell. That's something I learned as a journalist, and something I hope to demonstrate in your class. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the office floor, marking the passage of time during this extraordinary revelation. What had started as a confrontation about suspected plagiarism had turned into a powerful lesson about prejudice, perception, and the dangers of quick judgment. The silence in Professor Mitchell's office grew heavy as she sat back down at her desk. Her hands rested on Marcus's essay, but her eyes were unfocused, lost in thought. The last 10 minutes had completely shattered her worldview, and now she was trying to piece together where everything had gone wrong. I've made a terrible mistake, she finally said, her voice hardly above a whisper. Her face had lost its usual confident expression, replaced by something that looked like shame. Marcus watched her carefully. In his years as a journalist, he had seen many people face moments of truth about their own prejudices. Some got defensive. Others made excuses. The real question was always about what they would do after the revelation. Professor Mitchell, he began gently, mistakes can be learning opportunities. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions. I sat here, in this very office, judging your work based on what? Because you were quiet in class? Because you didn't fit my image of what an accomplished writer should look like? Outside her office window, the afternoon had grown late. The shadows had lengthened, and fewer students crossed the quad below. The whole scene felt suspended in time, like a photograph capturing a moment of profound change. You know what makes this even worse? She continued, standing up to pace behind her desk. Just last month, I led a faculty workshop about avoiding bias in grading. I talked about giving every student a fair chance. She stopped at her window, staring out but not really seeing anything. I thought I was one of the good ones. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. Being one of the good ones isn't about never making mistakes, he said. It's about what you do when you realize you've made one. Professor Mitchell turned back to face him. How are you so calm about this? You must be furious. I essentially accused you of cheating because I couldn't believe someone. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Because someone who looks like me could win a Pulitzer Prize. Marcus completed her sentence. Someone who sits quietly in the back of your class could be a professional journalist. She nodded slowly, the full weight of her assumptions visible in her expression. I'm calm because anger doesn't teach, Marcus explained. In my investigation of educational inequality, I learned that the most powerful changes happen when people face their biases honestly. Getting angry or defensive just makes people shut down. Professor Mitchell returned to her chair, picking up Marcus's essay again. This time, she looked at it differently, not with suspicion, but with a new understanding of the depth of experience behind every word. You know what's ironic, she said, flipping through the pages. Your essay is actually about this exact kind of prejudice, about how talented students are underestimated, how opportunities are denied based on assumptions. She looked up at him. And here I am, proving your point. Marcus nodded. Sometimes the best way to understand a problem is to experience it firsthand. A group of students laughed loudly as they passed by the office window, the sound breaking through the heavy atmosphere in the room. The normal world continued outside, unaware of the profound moment of reckoning happening within these four walls. I don't even know how to begin to make this right, Professor Mitchell admitted, her voice stronger now but filled with determination. Maybe you don't have to make it right, Marcus suggested. Maybe instead, you need to make it matter. Use this experience to change how you see all your students, not just me. Professor Mitchell looked at him with new eyes, seeing not just the quiet student from the back row, but the insightful journalist, the Pulitzer winner, and most importantly, the teacher he had become in this moment. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across her office, symbolically illuminating this moment of truth. Both knew that what happened next would be crucial, not just for them, but for every student who would sit in Professor Mitchell's classroom in the future. Professor Mitchell stood up from her desk, walked to the small coffee maker in the corner of her office, and poured 2 cups. Her hands shook slightly as she handed one to Marcus. This simple act of hospitality felt like the first step toward making amends. I owe you an apology, she said, sitting back down and wrapping her hands around her own warm cup. Not just a quick "I'm sorry," but a real apology that acknowledges what I did wrong. Marcus accepted the coffee with a nod, waiting patiently. In his years of investigative journalism, he had learned that sometimes the most powerful moments came from letting silence do the work. I failed you as a teacher, Professor Mitchell continued, her voice growing stronger with honesty. I looked at you and saw what I expected to see, a quiet student who didn't participate much in class. I never bothered to ask why you were quiet, or what experiences you might have had. She paused, taking a sip of coffee to gather her thoughts. When I read your essay, instead of being proud that one of my students could write so well, I assumed you must have cheated, because it was easier to believe you were dishonest than to question my own assumptions about your abilities. Outside, the campus bells chimed 5 o'clock. Most professors would be heading home now, but this conversation was too important to cut short. You know what makes this especially shameful? She continued, placing her coffee cup down. Every semester, I tell my students to challenge themselves, to push beyond their comfort zones. Then when you did exactly that, when you wrote about your real experiences, I refused to believe it was possible. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Professor Mitchell, may I share something with you? She nodded, grateful for any response to her confession. When I was investigating educational inequality, he began, I interviewed dozens of teachers. Many of them had the same blind spots you're describing. They would look at bright students from certain backgrounds and see only limitations, never possibilities. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But the teachers who made the biggest difference were the ones who could admit their mistakes and learn from them. They were the ones who changed their schools, one student at a time. Professor Mitchell wiped at her eyes, trying to maintain her composure. How many other students have I misjudged over the years? How many talents have I failed to recognize because they didn't fit my expectations? That's the right question to ask, Marcus said gently. But maybe the more important question is, what will you do differently from now on? She stood up and walked to her office wall, where dozens of student photos hung from previous years. I've always prided myself on being a mentor to my students, she said, looking at the faces. But today, I realized that pride might have blinded me to my own prejudices. Turning back to Marcus, she spoke with new determination. I want to make this right, not just with you, but with all my students. I need to do better. Be better. Marcus nodded. recognizing the sincerity in her words. The first step to solving any problem is acknowledging it exists. That's something I learned as a journalist. Your essay, Professor Mitchell said, picking it up from her desk again, it deserves more than an A. It deserves to be shared. Would you consider letting me submit it to the university's Journal of Student Writing? On one condition, Marcus replied, a small smile forming. That you write a foreword about what you learned from this experience. Not to shame yourself, but to help other professors recognize their own blind spots. Professor Mitchell felt tears welling up again, but this time they were different. Tears of gratitude for this unexpected lesson in humility and growth. I accept, she said firmly. And Marcus, thank you. Not just for forgiving my prejudice, but for turning it into a teaching moment. You're not just a great writer, you're a great teacher too. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the office floor as teacher and student, now both teachers and both students, shared a moment of understanding that would change not just their lives, but potentially the lives of countless students to come. 1 month after the confrontation in her office, Professor Mitchell stood before a packed room in the university's Faculty Development Center. More than 50 professors from various departments had gathered for her workshop titled Challenging Our Assumptions, Recognizing Hidden Talents in Every Student. She took a deep breath and began speaking. A month ago, I made a mistake that changed how I see everything about teaching. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the room. I nearly failed a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist because I couldn't believe he was capable of writing at that level. The room fell silent. Some professors exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing their own potential for similar mistakes. At the back of the room, Marcus sat quietly, watching his former professor share their story. He had agreed to be part of this presentation, understanding its importance for creating real change. I'm not here to talk about grading policies or academic integrity, Professor Mitchell continued, clicking to the next slide. I'm here to talk about the assumptions we make about our students before they ever turn in a single assignment. She shared specific examples from her experience, including how she had dismissed Marcus's abilities based on his quiet demeanor in class. As she spoke, professors in the audience began nodding, some taking notes, others looking thoughtful. The essay that I initially suspected of being plagiarized, she said, gesturing to the screen where parts of Marcus's work were displayed, is now being published in our university's literary journal. And my foreword to that essay tells this story, not to shame myself, but to help us all recognize our blind spots. In the weeks since their confrontation, Professor Mitchell had made other changes too. She had revised her grading rubrics to be more objective, started including diverse writing samples in her teaching materials, and begun meeting with each student individually at the start of the semester to learn their backgrounds and goals. Marcus watched as she shared these changes with her colleagues. He remembered their conversation after that first difficult meeting, when she had asked him to help her design this workshop. Your story needs to be heard, she had said, not just by me, but by everyone who teaches. Now, Professor Mitchell turned to address a new point. But this isn't just about race, she explained. It's about every assumption we make, about quiet students, about students who work full-time, about older students returning to education. Every time we think we know what a student is capable of based on anything other than their actual work, we risk failing them. She clicked to a new slide showing statistics about student achievement. When we expect less from certain students, we often get less. But when we truly believe in every student's potential, amazing things can happen. In the front row, the dean of the English department nodded approvingly. Since Professor Mitchell had first shared this story with him, he had ordered a department-wide review of grading practices and student evaluation methods. The student I underestimated, Professor Mitchell said, her voice growing softer, taught me more about teaching than 15 years in the classroom. He showed me that sometimes the quietest voice in the room might belong to the most accomplished person there. She paused, looking around the room. And he taught me something else too, that true education goes both ways. Sometimes the teachers must become students, and sometimes the students become our greatest teachers. At this point, she invited Marcus to join her at the front of the room. As he walked forward, the professors in the audience straightened in their seats, seeing him with new eyes. Together, they led a discussion about recognizing and challenging unconscious bias in education. The questions from the audience were thoughtful and honest. showing that Professor Mitchell's story had struck a chord. As the workshop ended, several professors stayed behind to talk more. The dean announced that similar workshops would become mandatory for all faculty members. What had started as one professor's mistake was growing into a movement for change across the entire university. Walking back to her office afterward, Professor Mitchell felt lighter than she had in weeks. She had transformed her shame into action, her mistake into a mission, and in doing so, she had begun to become the teacher she had always thought she was, one who truly believed in every student's potential. 1 year later, Professor Mitchell stood in the university's main auditorium, watching as hundreds of students filed in for the new semester's orientation. On the stage behind her was a panel of speakers, including Marcus Thompson, who had been invited to give the keynote address about breaking barriers in education. The story of what happened in her advanced writing class had spread far beyond the university's walls. Her article, Learning to See, A Professor's Journey from Prejudice to Understanding, had been published in several educational journals. Schools across the country had reached out to learn more about the changes her experience had inspired. As Marcus approached the podium, Professor Mitchell remembered that day in her office a year ago. How different things were now. The quiet student she had once suspected of cheating was today addressing the entire freshman class as a successful journalist, an advocate for educational reform. "Your professors don't know your story yet," Marcus began, his voice confident and clear. "They don't know if you won awards, overcome challenges, or achieve things that might surprise them. But here at Franklin University, they're learning to look past their first impressions and see your true potential." In the audience, new faculty members sat alongside returning professors. Each of them had now gone through the mandatory training program that Professor Mitchell had helped develop. Called Seeing the Whole Student, the program used her experience with Marcus as a central case study in recognizing and overcoming unconscious bias. Marcus continued his speech, sharing his own story. "Last year, I sat where you're sitting now. I chose not to tell anyone about my achievements because I wanted to see how people would treat me based on their assumptions. What happened next taught me, and this university, valuable lessons about judgment and opportunity." Professor Mitchell watched the faces in the audience. Some students nodded in recognition of their own experiences. Others looked surprised, perhaps realizing they too had faced similar prejudices. The faculty members in attendance shifted in their seats, no doubt thinking about their own classroom practices. After the speech, in the reception area, a young black student approached Professor Mitchell. "I read your article," she said quietly. "It made me feel brave enough to submit my poetry to the literary journal, even though my English isn't perfect yet. Last week, they accepted 2 of my poems." These were the moments that meant the most to Professor Mitchell now, seeing how her very public admission of bias had created space for students to believe in themselves and for other teachers to examine their own assumptions. Later that afternoon, she and Marcus met in her office, the same room where their confrontation had taken place a year ago. But now the office looked different. The walls displayed student work from diverse voices, and a framed copy of Marcus's essay hung prominently beside her teaching awards. "You know what the best part is?" Marcus said, settling into what had become his usual chair. "It's not just about us anymore. Every semester, new students and teachers learn from what happened here." Professor Mitchell nodded, thinking about all the changes the past year had brought. The university had revised its grading policies, created new mentorship programs, and established a committee dedicated to identifying and removing barriers to student success. "I got another call from State University yesterday," she told him. "They want us to help them set up a similar training program. That makes 15 schools now." Marcus smiled. From one mistake comes a movement. As they looked out her office window at the students crossing the quad below, Professor Mitchell thought about how many stories were walking around campus untold. How many talents remained hidden, waiting to be discovered by teachers who had learned to look past their first impressions. "Ready for your guest lecture next week?" she asked. Marcus now regularly spoke to her advanced writing class, helping students understand how to tell their own stories effectively. "Always," he replied, "though I still won't tell them about the Pulitzer until the end of the semester." They shared a knowing laugh, remembering how far they'd come from that tense confrontation a year ago. What had started as a moment of prejudice had transformed into a powerful force for change, touching lives far beyond their small corner of academia. Outside, the autumn sun painted the campus in golden light, just as it had done that day 1 year ago. But now it illuminated a different university, one that was learning, growing, and changing, one student and one teacher at a time.